Hello there, and welcome to Jawbone. We're going to try something a little different today. Fairly recently, I was lucky enough to have a conversation with my friend Dr. Iain McGilchrist. Now, you may know Iain already. He's famous for a book called The Master and His Emissary, and more recently, These Puppies, The Matter with Things, Part 1 and Part 2. And he had a dog in the race with those books. Books of that size, with the attention span we have these days. Some publishers thought possibly it wasn't the greatest mix, but it has more than a cult following. It is emerging as a deep classic of our times, and so I was thrilled to have a little bit of time to talk with him about it, especially the final chapter, which is a short book length itself. Now, I hope you know that you can actually come and study with me in real time over in England. If you go to martinshaw.com, you get all the details about that. And part of the luxury of that is sometimes you get access to my friends. And Iain was kind enough, actually gracious enough, to talk to a few of us over Zoom in the middle of winter. And what follows, what you're going to see, is the conversation that we have. And do keep going till the very end, because it's around the final third that Iain actually starts to dig out a few poems that he particularly loves. And as the Welsh would say, the Arwen descends at that moment. So look, we hope you enjoy it, and if you do, let us know, and there will be more of this type of thing. Onwards. I was recently in a taxi with a writer called Rod Dreher, who's written many books, and he was so overwhelmed with the matter of things. We were on our way past Buckingham Palace for him actually to be giving a very important keynote speech, which he was rewriting in the taxi whilst cribbing beautifully from your work. So, Iain, I just wanted to let you know that in case I forgot to tell you.
Rod's a good man.
Yeah, Rod is a good man. He's a good man. And so I have had quite the day today, Iain, combing through both books. And topics in my mind at the moment include your notion of what you call the relational or integrating with the world, how indeed we would do that. A fascinating phrase that I've never heard of before, internal consistency, which I realize I'm quite a fan of in middle age, but I need to look at that. And then finally, if we get there, Luciferic intelligence and the sense of the sacred. I mean, I was quite excited in the first half of the book, thinking, oh, great, this is leading to all sorts of questions I have for Iain. And then, of course, as I picked up the second half of the book, you had answered all those questions and addressed every conceivable thing that came from it. So before I ask anything too big, what I remember about when we last met, which was in January in an Oxford University, where you introduced me to the wonder of something called snuff. I'd never had snuff before, and the genius of a sleep apnea machine. But aside from those things, you told me something astonishing. You told me that initially, at least, the book was self-published.
Well, yes, it remains effectively self-published. I'm not sure that Perspectiva Press would quite accept that, but they would certainly accept that the relationship is a very unusual one. So I put up the money, I found the editors, I found the typographer, I designed the cover, and I have it the way I want it to be, and there's no publisher telling me otherwise. And at the last minute, there was a very nice launch for the book at which Jonathan Rowson, who is the head of Perspectiva, was giving a short speech, and he said it was rather like one of those things where you come in at the sort of 90th minute of the game, score a goal, and suddenly there you are. So he came along at the very last minute and said, "Why don't you just put our name on it?" And so that's how it is.
Wow. Wow. And I remember, I remember the buzz that has actually continued. It's been a few years now, hasn't it? A couple of years at least since the book has been out. But the buzz around it just seems to continue beautifully.
I
And
hope so, yes.
were you through an original press? You got through your original set of copies quite quickly in
Of
terms
the
of your first print run.
Oh, yes, it went much better than I anticipated. I had to put up a lot of money of my own,
Yeah,
and I could see I was going to get it back, which is very useful,
good.
and some. And I mean, very briefly, the reason I ended up publishing it myself was that, as you know, the Master and Embassy was published by Yale. My
Yeah.
my agent said, "We're not going back to Yale. They did nothing for you." We're going to Penguin Random House. They will be much better at sort of publicizing. And I met Stuart Profit there, and we got on very well. We signed a contract. After a very short while, I wrote to him saying my original idea that this was going to be a sort of bluffer's guide to the Master and his Emissary is not something I want to write. I want to write about the philosophical and indeed theological implications of the first book. And he said, "That's fine, we trust our authors, go ahead." I said, "Going to be much longer?" He said, "Well, never mind." Anyway, I finally turned up with a manuscript which was 4 times longer than the contracted length. And he sat on it for 5 months, and he didn't say a word, one way or the other, discouraging or encouraging, either to me or my agent. And then at the end of it, he said, "Yes, it's great, we're going to publish it, but it must be half the length." And I said to the half dozen of my friends who actually read the whole thing at that stage, "You've got to be brutally honest with me. If I won't want to hear it, but if it's true that it would be much better for half the length, I will do it." And every one of them said, "No, you'd lose so much. It would be a kind of act of savagery." So on the grapevine, Yale heard that actually this had happened, and they said, "Look, we'll take it and publish it as it stands, no questions." And I thought, yes, but the trouble is that'll be 15 months. And already now, for about a year and a half or 2 years, I've been saying in lectures, in a book soon to come out, I will be discussing these things. And I want it to come out soon. And I thought the only way I can do this is actually to publish it myself. And I've never published as much as a pamphlet in my life. So I had to find out all the ins and outs of publishing and permissions and copyright things and printers. I went around the world looking for good printers. And anyway, I fell on my feet in the end, and there you are. There's the book.
Well, I find the notion of a shorter version horrific, although I must say the final chapter, The Sense of the Sacred, is a book within a book for
Mm,
sure.
mm.
And I would really, really hope in some way that's so important. It's such an extraordinary finish, quite unexpected in a way, that I hope that continues to find its way out into the world.
Yes.
You certainly, the book never feels like it's run out of puff, ever, ever.
Good. No, no.
And it's a lot to do with, I think, your skills actually as a writer. I was friends with a very eminent American poet called Robert Bly, and
Yes.
he once, I asked him to do it. I said, "Would you read this manuscript as it in an adversarial manner? You've been very encouraging to me, but locate the enemy within me and have at it."
Yes.
And he said to me, he said, "The problem is," he said, "you dance in words so frequently, the reader gets dizzy and cannot feel the grief of your ideas, cannot feel the grief of your ideas." And what is so admirable in the heft and the ambition of that book is that it never becomes pretentious. And you always feel as a reader that in a very unpatronizing way, you are holding our hand as you walk us through this enormous project.
That's very nice to hear. That's how I would like it to feel. I
Good.
didn't want people to feel it was a daunting task. But I also I have considered publishing the last chapter, chapter 28, as a book on its own, because as it stands, it's over 100 pages.
Yeah.
But I felt that I needed to explain the background, why I would end up saying these things about the sacred and the divine.
Mm.
And I think that so many people in the modern world are so opposed to these ideas that unless I've been able to show them, now look, let's look at some science and let's look at reason and let's look at intuition and imagination and yes, all that looks good. And here's time and space and consciousness and matter and the one and the many and the coincidence of opposites. And they go, yeah, I can see what you're getting at there. And then I want to go, now let's open this door. What do you think about this? And I think that a lot of people are amazed because I've found people writing to me saying, you know, as somebody who's never really understood what people see in religion, or as an atheist, confirmed atheist, or whatever, having read what you have to say, I find myself thinking quite differently. And so many people write saying it's made their life much richer, which is a lovely thing to hear.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, when they come at you with religious experience rather than religious theory,
Yeah,
it can feel like an imposition, not an invitation. But the way that final chapter reads is an invitation into wonder. It seems to me that's how I experience it. So it's extraordinarily moving. Um,
that's very
I,
good.
I I wanted. I know this is an odd way to begin, but I wanted to tell a very quick personal story,
Oh, yes,
because in terms of right and left brain, and please flesh out as much or as little of that as we go, whatever you want.
yes.
About 12 years ago, I was in an unexpected situation. I was with a tribal group in Northern California called the Miwok, and the Miwok invited me into their longhouse to be the storyteller, to sort of anoint the coming of age of the young men and young women in the group. And what I remember was entering the longhouse late afternoon, I think probably dusk. So you're going into a building where the floor is, earth. There's a few poles keeping the structure up. There's smoke, and you have officially entered the timeless. Nobody seemed to have a watch. Nobody said when this story may be told. Nothing. You are into what they call deep time. And I sat and I waited and I sat and I waited and I sat and I waited. And it would have been about 4 o'clock in the morning where, for no apparent reason, an old guy next to me just tapped me on the shoulder and said, "It's now, it's now." So I sprung up and started to tell a story. And it was actually a Russian fairy tale, but it felt energetically right for the moment. But I'm about halfway through the story, and the oldest guy in the place, the oldest man, gets up from the group. He's got a kind of robe round him, and just walks right past me and out the door. And you can imagine this felt like a bit of a catastrophe. I thought that the something in the way I was telling the story had offended him. So I was mortified. I limped to the end of the tale. By the time I come out, dawn is breaking, and I'm looking around and watching everybody leaving. The ceremony is over, and I see that the old man is actually outside. So I go over to speak to him, and I realize that he's carrying a long stick. And I said to him, "Grandpa, I did notice that you left. I'm terribly sorry. If there was something in my story or the way that I told it that offended you, that's just the worst possible outcome for me." And he looked and he smiled and he just said, "Stories that good bring snakes."
Uh,
And he
uh,
said, "I'm outside the longhouse protecting you to finish the story with my staff."
wow. Now that's
That's
very interesting to me. Yes. Hmm.
that is the kind of world that I wanted to live in. And the jumps required for a right brain interpretation of that, it's so extraordinarily beautiful, so disorientating, that when I was reading the book today, I was thinking to myself, when have I had undistilled, pure experiences of what I think of the best of the right brain? And it was something about that suddenly reality was magical again. It was luminous again. I also had an experience once with a Lakota Sioux medicine man, where we were in Wales of all places. It was clearly going to rain. And he said, I don't want it to rain. I want to light a fire. So he aimed his pipe at the clouds and for several minutes spoke to them as if he was being reunited with a girl that he'd loved when he was 16.
Good Lord. I'm sorry, I'm
Uh,
fiddling
yeah.
around because I need to recharge my computer. It's going to go out. But what an extraordinary thing.
So both encounters did something that I felt you were pointing towards in the book, really, which was a relatable universe, which brings her on to really your idea of what the relational is, the sense that we think what brings the world together is things, but actually it's relations. And Wallace and the guy from the Miwok tribe opened me up to relationships and words being part of that relationship.
Well, yes, of course, there's so much there. As you know, I argue something that sounds paradoxical or impossible um, at first hearing, which is that it's relations that dictate what the thing that is related is. It is only what it is because of the relations it has. The almost infinite set of relations, the web of relations in which it sits, make it what it is. So you can't start with those things before the relations. I'm not going to say any much more about that, except to say that modern physicists are, to my gratification, saying very similar things in the realm of physics. So that idea that relation is primary and makes things what they are is very important. But I also thought that the thing, as I understood it, what you said was that the elder in the coming of age ceremony was protecting you because a story as good as that was likely to attract something that you needed to be protected from. Now, if that is right, I mean, that is so much in my thinking at the moment, and it would be very much in Rod Dreher's thinking too, which is that there is a psychomachia going on, a battle for souls. And I've never really thought like this until recently. It seemed rather old-fashioned, and most people want to say that evil is just non-existent. It's just a sort of falling short. But every mythology around the world seems to know that there are spirits, forces, whether they're in us, whether we originate them, whether they come to us or whatever they are, that can destroy. And it's that feeling of the relation between not just two things that we like, but also a thing and its opposite that is essential. I mean, I don't think there can be good without there being evil. And I believe evil is not a negative, if you see what I mean. It's not, I mean, it's not something we want, but it's negative in that way. But it's not a negative in the sense that it's just an absence of good. I believe it has a power of its own. And I believe that in the end, good can be stronger than evil in the way that love can be greater than hate, in that love can embrace the one that hates, but the hater can never embrace the one that loves.
Yes, yes. You're reminding me of something that exists in myths around the world, but also storytelling traditions around the world, which is the storyteller needs to protect their imagination. It's a thing that needs to be protected. And it actually has limits to it. A storyteller is almost somebody slightly set apart. So the onslaught of trance states that are waiting for you in our phones and computers and the rest of it, the sort of chloroform of distraction required would be seen as really rather dangerous. And the folks that I've mentioned, the Miwok, Wallace Black Elk, the Lakota Sioux, these were all and are all storied cultures. One of the things that was so touching for me in your book is in part 2 of The Matter with Things. It begins with an Iroquois story, I think, an extraordinary story that's going to take me a long time to sit with. But I wondered, you say a brave thing in the book, and you're right, I think, in the sense that you've built up to it over many hundreds of pages, the notion that a completely left-brained society, I can't call it culture, but a society, would have almost a luciferic intelligence to it. And something that you've also said, and I remember this from The Master and the Emissary, you were saying historically there's been 2 situations where we've completely succumbed to that: the end of the Greek, the Greek civilization, and the end of the Roman. But now possibly the peril is even greater now.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure that I'd go so far as to say that I wouldn't really know enough to be able to say that what I know of the end of the Greek civilization and the end of the Roman civilization were exactly luciferic, or that a luciferic force was unleashed. But I think that the narrowness, the sort of paucity, the poverty of thinking that comes from the left hemisphere and its obsession with only one value, that of use and power, destroys. I think it destroys everything that might be good in a civilization. And so you see civilizations coarsening themselves, their values becoming coarser, their motivations being control only, an enormous growth of administration and bureaucracy, a kind of machine thinking, even in an era when machines were not that important, starts to become manifest in those cultures. And then quite quickly they collapse and their art deteriorates and the quality of life and the things that they had invested in that actually were great steps forward in civilization are lost. But I do think that now there is something luciferic. I mean, I don't want to sound, as people say now, sort of woo-woo about this, but I've got to be true to experience. I think in my life I've come across evil, and I don't think that it's in any way adequate to say that it's just an absence of good. And I do think that there is now a kind of sustained force which is driving in exactly the opposite direction to that in which Christianity would wish it to be taken. And so it takes things that look as though they might be the sort of thing that Christianity might preach, but in fact inverts them. And so, in the name of being loving, or there is no love. There is authoritarianism, there is self-righteousness, there is hatred, there is a belief that there is only one way of thinking, and so on. And so we get into this society we're now in which enormously simplistic thinking is bandied about from side to side by people who are as mindless as one another because they're so sure that they're right, but they're not listening to one another. It's about as far from compassion and tolerance as it could be, and yet it's often put about in the name of compassion and tolerance. And I can't remember the name, I think it's called Ryan Mead. There's a philosopher and jurist in Oxford who said, no good thing, no evil thing ever comes along except in the guise of something good. There are no exceptions. So when people start to do things that are very badly wrong, they say them in the name of something that they think is unimpeachably good.
My goodness. There is a fairy tale that I've worked with for years. I wrote a book about it. And the image in the fairy tale is this, that the night you were born, there was a twin that you don't know about. And the twin was thrown out of the window by the midwife. And the nice, right-brained McGilchrist, fine, it's fine. The hair is combed, the little shoes are polished, but wandering in the
They're
forest,
not actually.
yeah, is the exiled twin that culture at large would like you to forget. And the old mythic idea that it is the business of growing into a true human being that you seek out that twin which society tells you does not exist.
Mm.
And I think for most of us, we get near that actually when we locate what James Joyce used to call aesthetic arrest. When you are claimed by a piece of music, you are claimed by a dance or food or rapture or interest of some kind that is not just a sophisticated taste that you develop, but is something where you're just sort of grabbed by, like watching the sun come up in the morning. But another thing that you learn in the fairy tales is that if that twin remains exiled, it will grow hostile towards you.
Yes.
So when you then try and approach it, you're not going to get the reaction from the deep chthonic that you expected. Uh,
Exactly.
I was, as I was reading today, I felt some of the wild twinness in the ideas. You know,
Hmm.
there's sort of there's a forested quality to them. As the book continues, the forest sort of starts to grow around the pages.
Well, as you know, the last part of the book, the second volume that you're reading, begins with a chapter on the coincidence of opposites, which is really partly what we're talking about here. And of course, Jung was a great believer in myths, and it's what Jung called the dark side. And as a psychiatrist, one of the things I found most important for people's health is to be able to accept their inevitable dark side. They think that by pretending they don't have it or pretending to have banished it, they will be better. But in fact, they're not. They become damaged. They become, in fact, intolerable to live with. And they can't understand why, with such good intentions, everything seems to be going wrong in them and around them. And so this acceptance that there is always a dark side is very important. Now, the trouble is, in our culture, we live in an intellectual world where everybody thinks it's black and white. Well, not everybody, but you know what I mean. The sort of drift is this is right and good. And so more and more and more of it is what we must have, not realizing that when you're looking at the good, you're ignoring something else, which is also good that you're excluding. And so you need to be able to bring these two things into relation. And, the simplest possible illustration of this is that, freedom is generally considered a good, and I think it is. But the pursuit of anarchy ends up inevitably in tyranny because
Yeah.
it can't be tolerated. And these things, anarchy and tyranny, are very close to one another. And what one is looking for is not, by the way, a sort of soft midpoint that is just like a weak compromise, but actually something that comes from the proper tension of these two held together at the same time.
That's it. You described it as a bowstring, I remember.
Exactly.
Yeah. In the way I think of a similar thing, really, I spend a lot of time looking at birds. I enjoy birds. And a few years ago, I realized that if you look at a magpie long enough, you'll realize that it has a blue feather tucked away. There's usually a blue feather on a magpie. It's not black, it's not white. It's this little blue, tacit little blue feather. And for me, the best of poetry, the best of myth, that's a place what I would call it a blue feathered language. And it has to dwell, it has to live in the tension of what you know very well, Keats talking about negative capability. Your capacity to do that and not completely lose your marbles and to be able to build a coherent culture worthy of the name whilst existing in that tension seems to me the best of romanticism.
Yes.
Sorry.
I mean, no,
Yeah.
that's right. And I mean, the word romanticism is unfortunate, but it's the word we've inherited,
Yeah.
um, because it suggests something that is perhaps intellectually fantastical. But in fact, the philosophers of the Romantic period were probably the most sophisticated philosophers the West has ever produced.
Mm.
People like Goethe and Hegel and the Schlegel brothers, Schelling, and so on, and the Wordsworth and Coleridge. In fact, I mean, in English, I mean, terrifically important thinkers about things that were pushed out of Western philosophy for a couple of thousand years. Like a thing and its opposite can be true. I mean, to come back to what we were talking about. So
Yes.
I think that's right. It's very important to hold this tension, and if you don't hold it, what happens is that it collapses. The tension is good. It's not a bad thing. It's something that you must endure.
Mm. I have greatly enjoyed being sort of immersed in the Eastern Orthodox Church for the last 2 or 3 years. A very, very unexpected return to Christianity in midlife. Um, a quite frightening experience to a degree, because suddenly, back to that wonderful phrase of yours, my internal consistency went bonkers when I hit 50. I went on a 101 day vigil in a forest, and at the end of it had what you could only describe as a Christian encounter, which was the very last reason I went out there, or so I thought.
Hmm.
But coming back,
It's an amazing story.
orthodoxy is very good on unknowing. It's
Yes,
very good on unmapping. It's
yes,
very good on the stuff we simply do not know about,
yes.
but not, as you've described in the book, not the knowing of ignorance, but
No,
the achievement of being a human being is knowing how little you know and
yes.
being surrendered to that. Rilke says what we need is to be defeated decisively by constantly greater beings.
Mm, mm.
And I thought something of that. Could you tell me a bit about what you mean by unknowing in the book?
Well, it's something that's interested me all my life because I started off actually as a literary critic in Oxford, teaching and writing. And it seemed to me that all our attempts to pin things down, make them explicit, so that we finally got them and now we know them, were working in the opposite direction to the work of art, which was creating something that was completely new and unique, couldn't therefore be known immediately, but had to be experienced. And in that experience, much the most important part of it needed to remain implicit. So implicitness is the first thing that is an unknowing. You can't put it into clear language in the way that you can a manual about how to use your dishwasher. And I sometimes say everything that really makes life worth living, love, poetry, music, art, architecture, myth, story, narrative, religion, all these things resist being diminished, which they inevitably are, by just being encapsulated in a few words. Language is not supposed to be able to, we shouldn't think that it can capture reality. What it can do is capture for a while certain very specific areas to enable us to manipulate them helpfully. So that's part of the unknowing. And I think that it's an experience that I've had and that probably most people have if they um, develop at all intellectually, is that when you're young you think you know things, and then as you get older you realize how little you do know, and the kind of unknowing which is as you say, and as I've suggested, not the same as ignorance. Ignorance is what you have before you know, but unknowing is what you have after you've got through knowing. And I know that action can be like this as well. So there is laziness on the one hand, and then there's action. But then there is what the Tao Te Ching calls inaction or non-action or undoing and so on, or non-doing. And this area is the most desirable area. So at the end of their various lives, people as different as St. Paul and Socrates and Montaigne, their conclusion was, what do I know?
Mm, mm, yes. All right. In terms of what we know, something I'd asked you to bring with you, if you were willing, was a poem. Did you have a poem you'd be willing to read us?
Yes, I mean, I brought a couple if we have time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Neither of them terribly long, um, but I do have them. Um, and I thought, most poetry is in some sense rather sad, because the really deep stuff in life has a kind of plangency, perhaps even a sweet sadness, but it's never simply kind of rah, rah, rah. And I didn't want to be a terrific downer on your on your program. So I looked for a poem that I think is extremely positive. And I also looked at one that talked about, yes, that poignancy in time. And the poem that I wanted to talk of the celebration of life is A Spell for Creation by Kathleen Raine,
Oh,
which I'm sure you know. Um, and the other poem, which is, the God, being asked to select one or two poems is much worse than Desert Island Disc. Where do you start and where do you end? But I always go back to Hardy, and I thought that his remarkable poem at Castle Botterill, which is about the scope of time and what time means and how it changes things, is very important. So, what would you like me to do?
I'd like you to read both of them.
All right, okay.
Please do.
So this is Kathleen Raine's A Spell for Creation. I think it's a wonderful, mystical, rapturous poem that means a great deal, and one has to sort of, yes, go with it when one's hearing it, but then perhaps reflect on it.
Okay.
Within the flower there lies a seed. Within the seed there springs a tree. Within the tree there spreads a wood. In the wood there burns a fire, and in the fire there melts a stone. Within the stone a ring of iron. Within the ring there lies an O. Within the O there looks an eye. In the eye there swims a sea. And in the sea reflected sky, and in the sky there shines the sun, within the sun a bird of gold. Within the bird there beats a heart, and from the heart there flows a song, and in the song there sings a word. In the word there speaks a world of joy, a world of grief. From joy and grief there springs my love. O love, my love, there springs a world, and on the world there shines the sun, and in the sun there burns a fire. Within the fire consumes my heart, and in my heart there beats a bird, and in the bird there wakes an eye. Within the eye, earth, sea, and sky. Earth, sky, and sea, within an O, lie like the seed within the flower.
Oh my goodness. My goodness. Do you do you think it's important in life to be able to praise? Do you think praise is important?
I think it's very, very important. I think praise and thanksgiving are the most important aspects of prayer
Mm,
and of ritual, in fact. Um, you know, Conventionally, prayer is divided into adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication. But I think of these, the greatest is adoration or thanksgiving. And St. Francis said, when you pray, you should ask for nothing, which is interesting, isn't it? Because we all, in a way, need to ask for something, not not necessarily something venal, but just help in being a better person, for example.
My goodness. Well, could we lean on you for one more?
Yes, sure. So that would be one of a number of wonderful poems that Hardy wrote after the death of his wife Emma. And as an old man, he finds himself in a place that he has a memory from long, long ago. As I drive to the junction of lane and highway, and the drizzle bedrenches the wagonette, I look behind at the fading byway, and see on its slope, now glistening wet, distinctly yet, myself and a girlish form benighted in dry March weather. We climbed the road beside a chaise. We had just alighted to ease the sturdy pony's load when he sighed and slowed. What we did as we climbed and what we talked of matters not much, nor to what it led. Something that life will not be balked of without rude reason, till hope is dead and feeling fled. It filled but a minute. But was there ever a time of such quality since or before in that hill's history? To one mind never, though it has been climbed foot swift, foot sore, by thousands more. Primeval rocks form the road's steep border, and much have they faced there, first and last, of the transitory in earth's long order. But what they record in colour and cast is that we too passed. And to me, though time's unflinching rigour in mindless rote has ruled from sight the substance now, one phantom figure remains on the slope, as when that night saw us alight. I look and see it there, shrinking, shrinking. I look back at it amid the rain for the very last time. For my sand is sinking, and I shall traverse old love's domain never again.
Mm.
So there we are.
Wow.
Yes,
Wow.
one doesn't need to say anything after a poem like
No,
that.
no, no.
That was one of the reasons I left the world of Lit. I stopped wanting to have opinions about great works of art.
Yes. I have a school which some of the students are listening in at this moment that is 21 years old. And usually when a year begins of teaching, there's a bit of clapping at the beginning in the first couple of sessions. And then if we are proceeding appropriately, the claps become less and less, and the silence becomes a presence all of its own, a companionable silence filled with old loves and figures and characters from stories and the old saints, all of that poignancy. I experience, and I'm only in my 50s, but already, you know, I think 3 friends of mine will have died in the last fortnight.
Oh,
And
yes.
so there's a sort of a procession,
Mm,
of what you do, how you curate loss,
mm,
why beauty matters, why
mm,
it matters to remember people in a ritualized,
mm.
affectionate, dignified manner, all of those things. And as you were reading that second poem, which I loved the first one, but the second one is even more profound for me. Um, You live, don't you? You live way up in the wilds on Skye.
Mm.
I'm sure you told me that you live sort of on the last track, the last house on the last possible place you can go. Is this true?
Well, it is, yes. It happens that the road ends and then there's my house and then there's the sea. So, yes.
Was that something you longed for when you were younger? I presume. I mean, I know a little bit about your work history. You've lived and worked in lots of places. Was there always in your mind, I'm going to get myself to Skye?
Oh, gosh. Well, my dad was a Scot, as you can probably tell from my name.
Yeah.
And we often took family holidays in the Northwest Highlands and Islands. And he liked island holidays, and I did too. And I had a sense when I was only very young that there was something different about the life in Scotland, at least in the wilds, that what we experienced in relatively urban England was was a pale imitation of life, but the real full-blooded life was something north of the border. I now don't take this rather simple-minded idea too seriously, but I found this place actually some 25 years ago and thought it was probably the most remarkable place I'd ever seen in the world. And that if the house ever became for sale, I would buy it. And I was told it never would be because it had belonged to the same family for a couple of generations, and it was a very successful B&B.
Mm.
Um, but then one day I was just sort of idly looking on the internet as one does. One has lists in life like buy yogurt, and then there are other ones like learn the harpsichord and move to Scotland. And so I was idly kind of looking for houses in Scotland, and this particular house came up for sale. And so, I mean, it was sort of obvious I had to buy it. But it's in a very magical setting. I don't want to encourage too many people
No, no.
to visit it, but it is a very magical setting. And somebody who came by called to me in the garden and said, I need to tell you about this place. I'm a specialist in Chinese thought, and this place has the most extraordinary, I can't pronounce it properly, but feng shui or whatever it is. And it's got the something, the dragon here and the something there, and it just had everything. And I felt that too. I wouldn't have put it in those terms, but I just felt it had every kind of archetype in the most beautiful way.
Mm.
So I'm rather wedded to this place, although I now find myself an unwillingly single person living in a place that is very big to maintain and having a lot to do around the world. I thought that by my early 70s, I'd be, a more leisured man than I am.
I don't think so. You'd have to stop writing such interesting books. You have to, yeah, something very, very low key and boring is the only way.
I've been
So,
striving for that. I'm practicing it.
well, I've seen no evidence of it yet. So time is a flying arrow, and although I have a million things I'd love to talk about with you, I will have a look at the questions.
Sure, sure.
As there's a couple of questions. Yes, here is a very practical question. You probably asked it at every session, but it's a good one. This is from Ed. Can you recommend some practices to get the left brain back in his proper place?
Well, much as we've been talking about the virtues of unknowing and undoing, the way to make a change is often to stop doing certain things rather than suddenly busily, in a very Western and left hemisphered way, to start certain practices. So, although there are practices I could mention, and not to be sort of ridiculously frustrating about this, I mean, obviously, things like mindfulness is something one could practice, listening to music, doing poetry and reading poetry, spending time immersed in nature without having to think about anything, and certainly not engage with any kind of machine or phone or anything like that. I mean, I think these, I don't want to go off on one, but I mean, you probably know what I feel about what that does to our lives. So I think those are the things, but I think the really important thing is to stop doing the things that get in the way. So our idea that we must achieve certain things, the idea that we should be able to articulate certain things, the constant chatter of monkey mind, which is effectively the left posterior cortex, kind of constantly processing everything immediately so that it's got it in, it's pinned it down, it's got it in boxes. Now, really, in order to start living, and certainly to experience the sort of things that spiritual traditions speak of, you have to still that monkey mind. You have to stop doing certain things, and that's quite difficult. But it is, if you like, a practice, and one has to be, a bit aware of what not to be doing. But I think it's, very much similar to advice to psychiatric patients, because I mean, obviously, if they're suffering from a major mental illness and need medication and hospitalization, that's another matter. But if, as often happens, people come to you with as it were, life problems, the first thing to do is to listen for a long time. And when I was rather naive, I would tell people things that they might do, but they didn't really see why I was saying those things. And indeed, if they'd been able to think of those things for themselves, they'd have done them, but they weren't doing them. And so the important thing was to refrain from telling them what to do, but to point to the things they were doing that they ought to stop doing in order to make space for things. See, the thing is, if we want to grow a soul, and Keats, wise beyond his years, called this earth a veil of soul making. And I believe that a soul is not just a thing, it's a process, and it's one that requires our attention. And we can either stunt it and kill it, or we can grow it. And in the modern world, we are being encouraged to stunt it and kill it. But if we want to grow that soul, we can't make it happen. We think that everything is done by getting behind and pushing in hydraulic fashion in the way that sort of 19th century machines work. But in fact, everything happens because there are things that draw from in front. And if we are not aware of that, we can't help this thing grow. So, for example, a plant knows, it has within it the knowledge of what it wants to do, how tall it wants to grow, the flowers it wants to make. I can't make it do anything different. What I can do is very important. I either clear ground for it so that it can flourish and give it some water. That's about it. After that, the thing will do its own thing. But if I try doing too much, I will stunt it and anything else.
Mm. Yes. Do you have anything else that you're tickling away at the moment in terms of writing and thinking?
Not very successfully, no. There are a number of projects that one I've had a contract for 10 years with OUP, and I feel very bad that I haven't done it yet, which is for an intellectual autobiography. And I'm not entirely sure what such a thing would be and where the boundaries of it would sit, because all life is of a piece in a way. And also, I don't particularly want to write about myself. I find it boring. So, but on the other hand, I did say to the editor of the series that I would, and so I have dutifully tried to make some efforts in that direction. But what I would really like to do is the opposite of what I've done all my life, which is to write at length and things that are enormously worked out and validated by references to the literature and so on, but just to write a book with no footnotes and probably only 80 pages long, just on the things that really, really, really in the end matter most in life.
Wow.
I'm going to be talking in London. Channel McGilchrist putting on a day at the Royal Institution in London on the 26th of October. And I think it's nearly full, but there might be a few places left. And I'm talking a couple of times, and Matthias Desmet is talking, and Elizabeth Oldfield. So, and the theme is the future of humanity, and there's just a lot to say about that. So I'm thinking along those lines, what really matters for being a human being? And most of the
Yeah.
answers that people instinctively give, or now anyway, not instinctively, but with their perverted instincts that are real intuitions about life, have been squashed, it seems to me, by a combination of totalitarian thinking, capitalism, and various other um, ways of living that provide perverse incentives to follow after greed and power and status, which have nothing whatever to do with happiness, and
No.
neglect the things that really matter.
Yes. I have just finished a book for Penguin that, God willing, will be out next year. It's funny, it's one of the few books that the title of the book hasn't quite decided itself.
Oh, okay.
But so we've read it's blown hot and cold. It'll probably be called How to Get Home, which is ironic because I'm so averse any kind of how-to book I can't bear. But
Yes.
in the end, I just thought, well, I think that probably is the title. And
Yes.
I was working on it last week. Just, when your eyes are numb to it all now, you can't see anything anymore. It's not fresh. But I
Yes.
one sentence that described the whole book for me at the end, and it was this: in each experience of beauty, we are being prepared for eternity. Each
Mm,
experience of beauty, we are being prepared for eternity. And
it's
I
a
think the business of being a human being
beautiful saying. Mm,
is to know that. And of course, what beauty is an enormous conversation, but
it is.
we know it when it claims us,
We
and
do.
it's emphatic because it tenderizes us. It
Yes.
tenderizes us, and it pushes us. So I just want to thank you again, Iain, for taking this time to be with this small group of folks who are down here in the West Country and anybody that's actually watching. And again, to say, God bless you and this great stuff that you're doing. And I'm just so glad you're in the world.
Oh, that's very, very kind. Well, as you know, I instantly knew that it was very important that you were in the world. I remember when we first met, and I just immediately wanted, can I give you a hug? I love you. I mean, you are a very important person to have in this world. And I think, what you just said about the attraction towards the incubation of beauty, goodness, and truth, so that these things endure in the cosmos. I could conflate, a very, very long story into the simple saying, this is what we were born for. This is why evolution has done the extraordinary thing it has done, which is very counterintuitive, of producing these exotic beings that are not long lived, that use a lot of energy, that suffer a great deal. But that is in the end towards the incubation of love in eternity.
Mm, mm. Wow. Well, we can't follow that. So I'm going to wave at you in sky. Thank you, Iain. Good
Thank
night,
you.
folks. Bye
Thank you
bye.
very much. Bye bye.